Hello and welcome everyone, I'm Space Wizard Total War and thanks for stopping by the first Guild Battle Tactics lesson, where I take two historical battle strategies and incorporate them into the identity of a faction here in Warhammer 3. I'll give you a brief history of that strategy as well as how you can apply it to Warhammer 3 with army compositions for early game, units available up to the second tier of buildings, mid-game up to tier 4, and then late game with the full available roster. I will note that unless the faction we're discussing is itself DLC only, I'll give army compositions made up of all troops available from base game with no DLC included. I'll give where I think those units can be used as upgrades as a kind of a side note as well. Let me know in the comments as well how you might modify the guild's strategy or perhaps even your own take on similar or other tactics you have found work and are fun to use. This is a campaign battle guide mainly geared towards new players, but I hope any veterans can perhaps learn something as well. For our first episode, to keep with the wizard theme, we'll be covering Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways. Now, normally when people hear Tzeentch, they immediately groan, thinking the only strategy I'm going to propose is drowning the world in a sea of blue and later pink horrors. Thankfully, while this is entirely viable, it's also entirely too boring for how I like to play Total War, so I promise to have a little bit more variety here. The two strategies from antiquity I think work best with Tzeentch are going to be the good old Changer's Checkerboard, and what I'm lovingly dubbing the Tzeentch Tercio. Let's start with the checkerboard, as it's the easiest to set up, understand, and utilize without too much micro. All things my monkey brain enjoys. Now, for the checkerboard's history, while I couldn't find a first actual recorded use, I did find that the father of the checkerboard formation, called the manipular formation, was adapted by the early Romans as a simple and effective general strategy for deploying their forces. The Romans deployed in 3 or 4 main lines with light skirmishing units out front, heavily armored triarii behind them to hold the line while the skirmishers retreat, and then secondary and tertiary lines of principes and histati to throw javelins and engage enemy flankers and rotate into the main line when the men tired. We're going to take this idea and warp it to fit a mostly missile-based faction. Changer's Checkerboard has 3 main advantages. Your missiles will be able to keep firing even as the line in front of them is caught up in melee. Your missiles are going to have better shots on blobbed up melee troops and have better angles to hit around those shields. And lastly, square units rotate a little bit faster to acquire new targets, allowing the checkerboard to quickly shift focus of problem areas when needed. Main weaknesses are going to be enemy magic users, artillery bombardments, and fast flanking cavalry. You can easily bypass your front line. Base game Tzeentch has a few ways to cover this weakness, but has many more of these roster holes plugged with DLC lineups. This we will keep in mind when figuring our army. When starting up a new campaign on Immortal Empires, Kairos Fate Weaver and the Shadows of Change DLC Lord, the Changeling, will be your 2 options. For this video, we are going to be figuring only Kairos' units into our army cops. The Changelings faction isn't going to be too much different than Kairos, losing the cavalry and picking up a unit of Changebringers, which should probably be renamed to the Flying War Crimes. For your early game with Kairos, no matter which of the formations you end up trying, you'll want to secure flying units and the Armored Forsaken as quickly as you can. The Warriors of Chaos DLC gives you a lot more variety in terms of expendable frontline and cavalry, while Shadows of Change brings some serious heavy hitters, and also the best early game frontline tank for Tzeentch with the Zangors. Start with Kairos, you'll have his beautiful 2-win-headed self, a Cultist of Fire, which is a low armor spellcaster with decent melee stats, 3 Blue Horrors, which are your skirmishing frontline, 1 Pink Horror, which acts as a lower range, high base damage missile troop, a unit of Chaos Knights of Tzeentch, which are heavily armored knights, Tzeentchian Furies, a flying, fairly weak infantry, and an extremely powerful Exalted Flamer that blasts a stream of warp flame that will also then drop down a vortex of fire wherever those warp flame impacts actually land. We'll fill this army in with 1 blue and 3 more pink horrors, 1 extra Fury, 2 Screamers of Tzeentch, which are a flying monstrous infantry that specializes in fighting large targets, and 4 Forsaken, which are really only here because they have the highest armor of our base Tzeentch infantry. Until you're able to generate the gold, replacing your Forsaken with just more blue horrors is completely viable. It'll just be noticeably more squishy when the bad guys do end up closing the gap. The same is going to apply for upgrades. If you can comfortably afford to replace those blues with more pink horrors, do take the time to do so. They are better in both melee and from range with quadruple the ammunition, just a strict upgrade on their grumpy blue brothers. We'll keep a note though that they're only 80, where you do have 120 with the blues. When taking to the field, we'll hold control while selecting our Blue Horrors and Forsaken, alternating units each time. When we drag them out, they'll do so in the order you selected your units in, making your checkerboard easier to array. We'll then select only our Forsaken units and use the arrow key to push them forward a little. We'll then put the pink horrors behind the gap betwixt your blue horrors for a lovely bit of layered fire for our foes. Now this formation alone will be enough to win you many battles with Kairos and his magic at the helm, but when the enemy outrange your horrors, or when they have more cavalry or big beasties than yourself, things will get pretty dicey very quickly for your Yogo Balls. This is where our Chaos Knight, Screamers, and Furies come in. Tzeentch Chaos Knights will trade very well with all early game cavalry, and your Screamers will be perfect for taking out light cavalry and disrupting archers or artillery. We'll array the Flyers mainly behind into the flanks of our formation, with the Knights out on one flank or the other. We'll have the Furies up front for the Screamers to screen them from any kind of missile fire on their way into the melee. Your Exalted Flamer you'll want to deploy behind your infantry line, but on the flanks to keep the horrors covered. The Exalted Flamer is basically a war crime stick, launching a stream of pink flame that's going to leave behind fiery vortices that will deal serious damage to targets unable to escape. Large or small, nothing is safe from the Exalted's warp fire. They can handle a bit of melee combat, but you'll definitely don't want them to stay in any amount of prolonged fighting. It's a very costly unit that's going to be very slow to replace if it's slain. Place Kairos above your army and your cultist in position next to your Exalted Flamer to help blob up baddies for melting, or just in case something closes the gap on your squishy boy. When you begin your battles, try to set up your checkerboard in a position on the map that gives you an advantage in some way. Be that being positioned behind a body of water to slow or weaken opposing infantry, positioned where your flanks are covered by an obstacle or the map edge itself, or with your missiles hiding in the woods to give them protection from return fire and cavalry charges. Make the map work with your formation to help you beat down your foes. Your front line's main job is to slow the enemy infantry and keep most pinned in place, while your line of horrors and Exalted Flamer get to work. Use your spellcasters to harass key targets. Blue fire and fireballs are great at dropping heroes, lords, or single entity monsters, and will also charge up Tzeentch's army abilities for casting spells. Use your knights to deal with approaching enemy cavalry or flankers, working in tandem with your Screamers. They can beat down just about everything early game. Flyers are going to be mainly though for dealing with enemy missiles, keeping aerial superiority, and dropping down at any other flankers that your foe might have. Once your fast movers have won their battles, they can be brought to bear on the remaining infantry, making short work of any survivors with devastating flanking attacks. This formation's main weakness is going to be when your foe has more range on their missile troops, or any artillery. To fight against those foes, you'll need to really make use of your Flyers, spells, and Knights to win the day. DLC changes you can make to this formation are mostly to the frontline troops. With Warriors of Chaos, you're guaranteed Marauders of Tzeentch, both with axe and shield, and wielding a spear. They do have very low armor, but also extremely cheap upkeep. You can replace your blue horrors with pinks much faster. I would not recruit the normal Marauders though, as they have way less melee defense, even with a shield. They make a front line almost as fragile as your blue horrors. Shadows of Change is a bit interesting, as it brings the Zangors. These slightly less mutated Tzeentchy boys are pretty much an insta-pick for me in the early to mid-game. They do split the middle and upkeep, and have very good defensive stats and a silver shield, will be fairly tanky in the face of small arms fire. They also have two excellent passives, Primal Fury, which makes them faster and hit harder as long as they have at least half of their leadership remaining, and Arcane Charge, which will boost their damage as long as spells are being cast on either side up to plus 20%, which is glorious. I'd also swap both of your Furies for two Cockatrice, which are just big blue chickens with high armor-piercing damage, a single-use activated ability that can freeze an enemy in place, and Terror, which will cause units with low leadership to automatically run away. They're also fantastic at hunting down enemy lords or heroes, or harassing light cavalry and archers. Now when looking to upgrade this formation for the mid-game, I replace all of our pink horrors with their Exalted Brothers, which are just strictly upgrades, while for our second line we'll bring in two units of Flamers, which are a lower range, squadron version of the Exalted Flamer without tornadoes, and either two more Exalted Pinks, or two Spawn of Tzeentch, horrible mutated beasts that are unbreakable and will have sundering attacks, which drops enemy armor they touch by 30. Base game Tzeentch was always very limited in terms of frontline, so Forsaken are going to remain up front. We'll pick up one more Chaos Knight, and an additional Cultist, and you are good to go for mid-game. DLC substitutions for the Warriors of Chaos are going to be proper Chaos Warriors of Tzeentch for your frontline instead of Forsaken, for powerful armor, a shield, and actual melee defense, and a Sorcerer of Metal instead of an extra Cultist, again for that extra armor and melee tankiness. Where you might prefer a Cultist is if you want for later on in the skill tree, they are able to summon in both Pink Horrors and later on a Lord of Change. So you either want the extra armor and tankiness, or you want the summons. Shadows of Change has a couple fun options to run. You replace the 2 Exalted Pink Horrors for Centaurs for fast flankers with good armor piercing, or if you can afford them, 2 units of Changebringers, which are just flamers given discs of Tzeentch to zoom around on. The ability to fly basically eliminates all of the normal weaknesses of flamers at the cost of some ammo and health. Flamethrowers that can bypass front lines and go straight for the weak points are always going to be a game changer for you. I'm also going to replace a single Zangor unit and the extra cultist with 2 Exalted Heroes of Tzeentch. These are fantastic tanks with really solid bonus v large, great duelists, and the ability to be mounted on a disc of Tzeentch for maximum mobility in the late game. I'd recommend just about every Tzeentchian army run at least a single Exalted Hero. That takes us on to the ultimate form the Changer's Checkerboard can assume. I'm going to try to take this formation to its absolute zenith for this one, creating something that is both a bit silly and wildly overpowered. Just how Tzeentch intended. Our front line is no longer going to consist of rank and file troops. Instead, we're going to have 4 Tzeentchian Soul Grinders, be the big blue wall for our squishier missiles. Our second line is going to consist of 2 normal flamers in the center and exalted flamers on their flanks. A lovely blue and pink wall of meltification. We'll keep our back line of exalted pinks, but replace our Chaos Knights with 3 units of Flying Doom Knights of Tzeentch, with extra mobility, aerial domination, and the ability to choose their battle since they fly. Make these an awesome upgrade to your normal knights. We're going to keep our Changebringers because they allow something fairly terrifying, which is a layer of arched fire from Exalted Horrors, mixing with Grounded Flamer and Exalted Flamer Blasts, mixing with the flying Death Stream the Changebringers can throw. So it is a 3-way blast of doom. Any large targets will be severely wounded, if not already slain due to the anti-large missiles your Soul Grinders can throw, and smaller infantry regiments won't even stand a chance against that much warp fire. Our DLC units allow you to swap just about any of the high-tier new units in for any part of the checkerboard. You can put Chosen on the front line or on the flanks for warriors, and you can deploy a Mutilith Vortex Beast or 2 to really set a tone. Once you've got the checkerboard down, by the late game you can really make the strategy your own with units you like the most. I'm sure you mad lads can take this formation a step further though. Make Tzeentch proud and let me know how you'd upgrade the Changer's Checkerboard. Now for the secondary formation we'll be discussing, it's going to be a little bit more complicated and it's going to be hailing from Spain. The Tzeentchian Tercio. The original Tercio was pioneered by Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba during the Italian Wars in the very early 1500s. The formation consisted of 1/3 pikemen, 1/3 swordsmen, and 1/3 arquebusiers, which were an early form of musket. Hence the name Tercio or third. The idea was to form a strong center core of swords, surrounded by bristling pikemen, with the gunpowder troops taking up the 4 corners of the formation to soften up approaching units. When enemy infantry closed the gap, the ranged troops would fall back into the safety of the pike square, and the swordsmen would get to work. Tercio formations would also usually work in groups to further strengthen their flanks and firepower, so we'll have a double setup for our Tzeentch version. Like I mentioned before, Kairos and the Changeling both have pretty powerful starting armies to build from, so we'll continue to stick with Kairos for now, since the Changeling army is much more powerful to start. The good news about the Tercio is even though it is going to be a little bit more micro-intensive, it is very simple in terms of what we're deploying early game. We'll have our roughly third of the army being blue horrors, 6 total, 8 pink horrors, 2 Forsaken of Tzeentch, our fire cultist, the Chaos Knights of Tzeentch, Big Kairos himself, and the Exalted Flamer. Each Tercio is going to be deployed in the exact same, just offset slightly, to allow for a deadly layering of fire for any foolish enough to attempt to flank. We'll start with our Forsaken, then surround them with blue horrors on 3 sides to be our defensive unit. Pink horrors you'll deploy on the 4 corners of the formation, and bam, you've made yourself a Tzeentch Tercio. Our Exalted Flamer will deploy on the same side as our Cultist, to try to blob up enemy formations to melt with our Warp Fire Flamethrower. Knights will be at the rear, and Kairos can fly around over the top and blast fools with blue fire or land on unsuspecting mages. When actually engaging in battle, you'll advance your Tercios slowly and steadily, trying to take the initiative where you can and secure the best position on the map, albeit slowly and defensively. As the baddies get closer, you'll let your missiles open up a salvo of fire or 2, then retreat your front pink horrors behind the melee wall. They can find a new angle on the foe to continue firing. Charge your core of the Tercio into whichever the enemy troops looks the most bloodied, and break their leadership, rinse and repeat for each new enemy unit closing the gap. Your cavalry will be aggressively hunting opposing fast movers, and once that duel is won, start charging them through missile lines or now through the exposed flanks of the enemy infantry. Your Exalted Flamer should have 2 priority targets. Firstly, any surviving fast movers. Secondly, point them directly at the enemy lord and let those flames rip. After that's done, you'll find the most blobbed up group of infantry and melt them right down into gibbering piles of goo. The main weakness of this formation with Tzeentch again is going to be enemy artillery, magic, and being outranged. So your use of magic with lords and heroes and knowledge that these are your priority threats in battle are going to be extremely important. As far as DLC changes go, taking Warriors of Chaos, I'd only replace 2 blue horrors, one at the front of each Tercio, with a Spear Marauder, or a more dedicated defensive unit as the main wall. For Shadows of Change, I just replace all of the defensive units with Zangors. There'd be 6 total. Plenty of Angry Goatmen to ask the enemy plenty of questions. When upgrading to the mid-game, which just means taking into consideration buildings up to level 4, we'll be replacing our Pink Horrors in the rear of the Tercio with Exalted Pink Horrors, or Flamers or Exalted Flamers if you can afford them for the front corners. We'll be moving the Forsaken to the front of our defensive formation, with blues on the sides and a unit of Spawn of Tzeentch for the heavy core. Please keep in mind that the composition I'm proposing is still extremely expensive. If you want to keep things fairly similar and just add the Flamers and Exalted Pinks, that is still going to throat chop most mid-game armies you run into. Warriors of Chaos upgrades I would make would be to remove all of the Forsaken and replace with 2 normal and 4 Halberd Chaos Warriors. Perhaps a single unit of Marauder Horsemen of Tzeentch. Just haven't quite found a place for them yet, although the ability to apply weakness to fire and drop armor by 10 is insanely powerful. For Shadows, we'll be adding Change Breakers instead of Flamers when we can afford them, because on campaign these guys cost more than Exalted Flamers, so something to definitely keep in mind. And I replace all of my Chaos Warriors or Forsaken with Zangors. I keep 2 of the Halberd Chaos Warriors for strong, heavily armored anti-large. For our final stage late game army, like with the Checkerboard, you'll have used this formation in so many battles, you'll likely be able to sub in all of the late game units you like best. For this base game example, we're going to replace the core of each army with a Burning Chariot of Tzeentch, which is an Exalted Flamer that can fly for even more Warp Docket. Frontal defensive units will be swapped in for Spawn, and the sides will change to Exalted Pink Horrors. Corners are also getting an upgrade. The front 2 Bastions will be swapped to Exalted Flamers, and the back 2 will be Soul Grinders of Tzeentch. Truly a thing of glory. Chosen make for a beautiful full-plate armored line that will be an amazing anvil for all of your Warp Flame, and Shadows lets you bring in the flying war crimes that are the Changebringers, and the Mutalith makes for an amazing frontal unit flanked by Chosen with Halberds. Tzeentch and Tercio honestly has been a formation that has performed way better than I initially thought it would. Again, I'd love to know your own take in the comments below. Give both of these formations a go next time you're piloting Tzeentch, or any other for that matter. I'd love to hear your own experiences. We'll be covering Grandfather Nurgle and his festering wave of sludge in the next Guild Tactics lesson. Thank you all so much for stopping by the video. If you enjoyed, remember to leave a like for Light God and a sub for the Subtron. I'll see you all in the next one.